My parents forced me to work for years, then tried to steal my savings for my sister's plastic surgery. I built my future from nothing, worked since I was 13, and thought I had finally earned their respect. Then they told me to hand it all over so my sister could get a new face. Now, she's broke, my father's humiliated, and I walked away with everything. I grew up knowing exactly where I stood in my family. And let me tell you, it wasn't in the spotlight. That place was permanently reserved for my older sister, Grace. If you ask my parents, she was the sun, the moon, and every damn star in the sky, while I was more like the dust floating in the background, barely noticed, mostly ignored. For as long as I can remember, Grace got everything she wanted, no matter how ridiculous it was. Expensive clothes, lavish birthday parties, the latest iPhones. If she even hinted at wanting something, my parents would break their backs to get it for her. Meanwhile, I learned early on that if I wanted anything, I had to work for it myself. It wasn't just about money either. Grace could do no wrong in their eyes. She was the princess of the house, treated like royalty even when she acted like a brat. If she failed a class, the teacher must have been unfair. If she got into a fight, the other person was jealous of her. If she dumped another friend for no reason, well, they probably deserved it. Meanwhile, when I was a kid, I got scolded for breathing too loudly. Grace is 7 years older than me, which means she had a solid head start on being the family favorite before I even learned how to walk. And she used every minute of it to cement her place as the golden child. Our mom and dad treated her like some rare, delicate gem, while I was expected to just be grateful for existing. Then there's my younger sister, Kelsey. She's 14 now and honestly, the only person in this family that I actually care about. Unlike Grace, Kelsey isn't an entitled nightmare. She's smart, kind, and thank God, nothing like our older sister. But that doesn't mean she's safe. If anything, I worry about her even more because my parents have started pushing her to be just like Grace. And I refuse to let that happen. Now you might think that being the only son would have earned me some kind of special treatment. Nope. Not in my family. If anything, being a boy meant that I had to prove myself even harder. From the time I was old enough to understand words, my dad drilled one message into my head. You're the man of the house. You have responsibilities. Now let's be clear, I was not the man of the house. I was a literal child. But that didn't matter. My father believed that men don't get things handed to them, they earn them. Translation? We're not helping you. Figure it out yourself. When I was 11, I asked my dad if I could have a small birthday party with my friends. His response? You're not a kid anymore. It's time to grow up and take life seriously. Like what? I was still losing baby teeth and this guy was acting like I needed to start filing taxes. By the time I turned 13, he sat me down and told me straight up, if I ever wanted money for college, I'd have to prove I was worthy of it. Show me you could be responsible with money, he said. Then I'll consider helping you. Now, I was naive back then. I actually believed him. I thought, okay, if I work hard and save up, maybe he'll help me out when the time comes. Spoiler alert, he never intended to help me. Not once. So at 13 years old, I started working. Not because I wanted to buy video games or new clothes, but because I genuinely thought I had to prove my worth to my father. My first job? Walking dogs around the neighborhood. At first, it was just 1 or 2 clients, but soon, I was dog sitting, pet feeding, and basically running a mini business. I loved animals, so I didn't mind the work. And honestly, I was good at it. I saved almost every dollar I earned, stacking it away like I was preparing for war. Because in a way I was. And what did my parents do while I was out busting my ass at 13? Nothing. They never asked how much I made. Never asked what I was saving for. As long as I wasn't spending it on dangerous things, which to them meant drugs or alcohol, they didn't care. The only time they even acknowledged my job was when they searched my room for hidden stashes of cash, convinced I was doing something illegal. But Grace? She was gifted money constantly. She didn't have to work. If she wanted something, my parents just paid for it. Meanwhile, I was working long hours, going to school, and stressing about money before I even had a driver's license. As I got older, things didn't change. Grace never lifted a finger to work. She coasted through life, never had to worry about bills, responsibilities, or consequences. I was expected to be self-sufficient before I even graduated high school. Kelsey was starting to feel the pressure, with our parents subtly pushing her to follow in Grace's footsteps. But here's the part that really stung. I never felt worthy of my father's help. He told me that if I proved myself responsible, he'd support me. But deep down, I already knew he wouldn't. No matter how much I saved, how much I worked, or how responsible I was, it was never going to be enough. Because in my father's eyes, Grace was always going to come first. I didn't know it at the time, but all those years of grinding, saving, and proving myself were leading up to the biggest betrayal yet. I thought I was working toward a future where my father would finally see my worth. Instead, I was about to find out that every dollar I saved, every sacrifice I made was about to be stolen from me. And all for Grace's next big glow-up. But I wasn't going to let that happen. Not without a fight. I worked like hell for years, thinking that maybe, just maybe, if I proved myself enough, my father would see me as worthy. I juggled school and jobs, taking whatever work I could find, constantly exhausted but determined. Dog walking turned into pet sitting, which turned into yard work, which turned into small handyman jobs around the neighborhood. Anything to keep saving, anything to show I could handle responsibility. My grades never slipped, but I barely had time for friends, barely had time to just be a kid. My classmates spent weekends playing video games or going to the mall while I was up at sunrise, working shifts before school, after school, and during every break. I watched my savings grow and told myself it would all be worth it in the end. I told myself that if I could just hold out, my father would keep his word and help me when the time came. Meanwhile, Grace lived like she had won the lottery at birth. She never worked a single day, never lifted a finger to help around the house. Every new trend, every new fashion statement, every new thing she decided she couldn't live without was handed to her without question. She breezed through life with this air of entitlement, convinced the world existed to cater to her. She wasn't smart, she wasn't hardworking, and she had zero skills outside of making herself look presentable. But that was enough for my parents. They told her all she had to do was be beautiful and find a rich husband, and she believed them. When she didn't feel like studying, they didn't push her. When she failed a test, they blamed the teacher. When she got into fights with her so-called friends, they told her she was right to cut them off. She went through people like disposable napkins, but it didn't matter because our parents always reassured her that she was perfect just the way she was. The double standard was suffocating. I worked for every cent I had, while Grace spent freely without ever thinking about where the money came from. I had to earn everything and she just had to ask. It was never more obvious than when she turned 18. My parents threw her a massive birthday party, rented out a fancy venue, hired a DJ, had an entire catering service. She got a brand new car, top of the line, just handed to her with a big red bow on top. I remember standing there, watching her squeal in excitement, and something inside me just shut off. I knew deep down that there wouldn't be a party like that for me. I knew that when I turned 18, my father wouldn't be handing me the keys to anything. I knew, but it still hit me like a truck when my own 18th birthday came and went with barely any acknowledgement. Just a passing happy birthday at breakfast and nothing else. No party. No gifts. Not even a cake. I didn't say anything. I just swallowed it down like I had swallowed every other unfair thing in my life. My parents didn't care about my sacrifices. They never did. When Grace announced she was getting married at 20, they threw her a wedding that probably cost more than my entire college tuition. They covered everything, every little detail, paid for the dress, the venue, the honeymoon, all because she was fulfilling her purpose. She had found a husband, and that was all that mattered. I didn't say anything. I just kept working, kept saving, kept my head down. I thought that if I could just get through it, if I could just prove myself, things would be different. I still believed in some stupid, desperate way that my father would come through in the end, that he would see everything I had done, everything I had given up, and finally decide I was worth supporting. But I was wrong. I was so unbelievably wrong. I got into one of the best universities in the state with a full scholarship. When I opened that acceptance letter and saw that I had a full ride, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Pride. I had done it. All the years of working, saving, grinding through school while balancing jobs had paid off. I wasn't going to have to worry about tuition, and for the first time I thought maybe things were going to be okay. Maybe, just maybe, my father would look at everything I had accomplished and finally acknowledge that I had done exactly what he asked. That I had proved myself. That I had earned his help. I knew he wasn't going to pay for my tuition, I never expected that, but I thought at the very least he would help me with my living expenses. Just enough to keep me from having to work myself into the ground while trying to keep up with my classes. I thought that was reasonable. I thought I had earned it. When I told him the news, he actually looked proud of me. He told me I had worked hard, that I had earned my place. I rarely heard words like that from him, and for a split second I felt like maybe, just maybe, things were going to be different. Then he told me that since I had a scholarship, I was practically set, and that I could easily work to cover my living expenses. I was stunned. I had spent my entire childhood working because I thought that if I showed him I was responsible, he would help me. Now he was telling me that because I had done exactly that, I didn't need help at all. It was like a slap in the face, but I still held on to some hope. I told him I had saved a good amount over the years, but it wouldn't be enough to cover everything, and I had been hoping for at least some support from him so I wouldn't have to work full-time while studying. I had barely gotten those words out before he sighed and told me that he couldn't do much right now, because Grace was going through a rough time. That was when I felt it. Something inside me breaking. Something that had been holding back years of frustration, anger, and disappointment. Grace was always going through a rough time. There was always some new crisis, some new excuse for why she needed their full attention and support. I asked him what this time was, expecting another one of her usual dramatic breakdowns over something trivial. I wasn't expecting him to tell me that she wanted cosmetic surgery, and that he expected me to cover it with the money I had saved. I laughed. I actually laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. He told me that since I had a full ride and had been so good with saving money, it made sense that I should use it for my sister, that it was my duty to stand by family, to support Grace while she rebuilt herself, after everything she had been through. I couldn't even speak for a moment. Everything inside me just snapped. Years of being the afterthought, years of watching them pour everything into Grace while I was left to fend for myself, years of working myself into exhaustion just to prove I was worth something. It all exploded at once. I told him no. I screamed at him that I had spent my entire childhood working because of him, because of his stupid conditions, because of his twisted idea that I had to prove myself to be worthy of his help. I told him that I had spent my teenage years exhausted, juggling school and jobs while Grace sat around and did nothing. I told him that I had sacrificed everything, my time, my energy, my happiness, because I actually believed like an idiot that he would keep his word. And now he was telling me that instead of supporting me, instead of finally giving me the help he had promised, he wanted me to hand over every cent I had saved so Grace could get some plastic surgery because she was upset about her failed marriages. He tried to tell me I was overreacting, that I needed to do the right thing for my family. I told him that if family actually meant anything to him, he wouldn't have spent my entire life treating me like I was worthless compared to Grace. I told him that Grace had never lifted a finger, never worked a day in her life, never had to face a single consequence for her actions, and now she expected me to throw away years of my hard work for her? He had the audacity to say that this was my responsibility as a man. That was it. That was the moment I knew. I was never going to be good enough for him. It didn't matter what I achieved, didn't matter how responsible I was, didn't matter that I had done everything he asked. He was never going to see me the way he saw Grace. I was just a worker, a provider, an afterthought. I could have cured cancer, and it still wouldn't have been enough for him to care. I told him that he could go to hell. I told him I wasn't giving him a single cent, that I wasn't going to work myself into an early grave just so Grace could get her third nose job or whatever it was she wanted. I told him that I was done trying to prove anything to him. I had wasted too many years of my life chasing after approval that was never going to come. He could spend every last dime on Grace for all I cared, but he wasn't getting anything from me. Then I walked out, shaking with rage, my head pounding, my hands clenched so tightly into fists that my nails dug into my palms. I had no idea what I was going to do next. I had spent my entire life thinking that if I just worked hard enough, I would earn his support. Now I knew the truth. He was never going to support me. I was on my own, but I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I was done playing their game. If my father thought he could treat me like a second-class son while worshipping the ground Grace walked on, then it was time for him to face the consequences. It was time for the whole family to see exactly who he was. And I knew exactly who I needed to call. I sat in my room, still shaking, still burning with anger. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It wasn't even about college. It was about years of being ignored, years of being treated like I didn't matter, years of knowing that no matter what I did, it was never going to be enough. And now, after everything, my father expected me to hand over everything I had worked for just so Grace could have another shot at looking pretty. Like a new nose or a new set of lips was going to fix the fact that she had the personality of a wet paper towel. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break something. I wanted to make him feel just 1 ounce of the frustration I had carried my entire life. And then for the first time in years, I thought about my grandfather. Grandpa was the only person my father had ever truly listened to. He wasn't the kind of man who raised his voice, but when he spoke, people listened. I don't know why I hadn't thought about him before. Maybe because he lived an hour away, maybe because he wasn't around enough to see how bad things had gotten, or maybe because I had been so focused on proving myself to my father that I never considered reaching out to someone else. But now I needed backup. I picked up my phone and called him. He answered almost immediately, his voice steady as always. "Hey kid, what's wrong?" I hadn't planned what I was going to say, but the second I opened my mouth, it all came spilling out. I told him everything. How I had been working since I was 13, how my father had made me believe I had to earn my place in the family, how I had spent years saving money only to be told to hand it over for Grace's plastic surgery. I told him about how I had finally realized that no matter what I did, I was never going to be good enough for my father because he had already decided that Grace was the only one worth caring about. There was a long silence when I finished. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, slow and controlled, but he didn't say anything right away. Then finally, his voice came through, low and serious. "Meet me at my place tomorrow. We're going to talk about this in person." I barely slept that night. My mind was racing, flipping between rage, frustration, and the sinking feeling that no matter what I did, I was never going to get away from this family's bullshit. But for the first time, I also felt something else. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, I had one person on my side. The next day, I took the first bus to my grandfather's house. He was waiting for me on the porch, arms crossed, face unreadable. I barely got through the front door before he motioned for me to sit down and asked me to tell him everything again from the beginning. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react. He just listened. And when I was done, he sat back in his chair and let out a long breath. "Your father is a damn fool," he finally said. I didn't know what to say to that. "You don't have to worry about this," he continued, his voice sharp, decisive. "I'll take care of it." I should have felt relieved, but I didn't know what taking care of it meant. "What are you going to do?" I asked, my voice cautious. He leaned forward, his expression deadly serious. "I'm going to call a family meeting." My stomach twisted. A family meeting? That had never gone well for me before. The last time we had one, it had been about Grace's second wedding, and I had spent 2 hours listening to my parents gush over how beautiful she was going to look. This was different. This wasn't a celebration. This was a reckoning. I swallowed. "And what exactly are you planning to say?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "Your father thinks he can do whatever he wants because no one holds him accountable. I think it's time we reminded him that there are consequences." I had no idea what that meant, but the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. My grandfather had never been the type to yell or throw things. But when he decided something, it was final. And right now it looked like he had made up his mind. I nodded slowly. "Okay. When is this happening?" "Sunday lunch. Your parents won't suspect a thing." That gave me 3 days to wait. 3 days to wonder what the hell was about to happen. 3 days to imagine every possible scenario, every potential disaster. But the one thing I didn't feel anymore? Hopelessness. For the first time in my life, I wasn't going to be the one fighting this battle alone. My father had spent years making me feel like I wasn't worth his time. Now it was his turn to feel small. Sunday came faster than I expected. I barely spoke to my parents that morning, just nodded along as they assumed I was still sulking. They had no idea what was coming. Grace, of course, was in a good mood, acting as if the world revolved around her like always. She had been talking about her transformation for days, convinced that her glow-up was the only thing standing between her and some rich third husband. She had no idea she was about to have the worst day of her life. We arrived at my grandparents' house right on time. The entire family was there, my parents, Grace, Kelsey, and a couple of my uncles and aunts. My grandfather had set this up to look like a normal family lunch, something casual, something routine. My father was relaxed. He had no idea he was walking straight into an ambush. Grandpa waited until we had all sat down before he made his move. He started with my father, voice calm but sharp, asking him what he was planning for Grace. My mother mumbled something about helping her get back on her feet, but my father, still believing he had nothing to hide, said that they were exploring options for her. Grandpa wasn't buying it. "Really?" he said, tilting his head slightly. "Because from what I understand, the only plan in motion right now is taking your son's hard-earned money and throwing it at plastic surgery for your daughter. The room went silent. I could hear my father's chair creak as he stiffened. Grace froze, blinking like she had just misheard something. My mother looked at me, then at my grandfather as if trying to figure out how this had reached him. Dad forced a laugh, but there was nothing natural about it. That's not exactly how it is, Dad. There's been a misunderstanding. Grandpa wasn't interested in his excuses. He turned to Grace. Tell me, Grace. What college are you looking at? She blinked again, confused. What? You told your father you wanted money for your education. What schools have you applied to? Grace opened her mouth but didn't say anything. She looked at my father like he was supposed to step in and save her. My father, who had been caught off guard, just sat there, gripping his fork like it was a lifeline. You haven't applied anywhere, have you? Grandpa pressed. Grace stammered, but nothing came out. It was the first time in her life she had ever been put on the spot without my parents running to her rescue. Grandpa turned to me. And you? I sat up straighter. I got a full scholarship. But Dad said he wouldn't help me with living expenses because I should be able to handle it myself. He also told me to hand over my savings to fund Grace's surgeries. Grace kicked me under the table, but I didn't even flinch. My grandfather slowly turned back to my father. Is that true? My father exhaled sharply like he was losing control of the room faster than he could recover. Dad, look, it's complicated. Grace has been struggling and Grandpa slammed his hand on the table, making everyone jump. Enough. The silence that followed was deafening. I had never seen my father look so small. You are a grown man, and you've spent your entire life playing favorites. I let it slide because I thought, at some point, you would wake up and realize how unfair you've been to your other children. But this is beyond disgusting. You took the only hardworking person in this family and tried to rob him of everything he built for himself. My father swallowed hard, clearly scrambling for something to say, but Grandpa wasn't done. You know that inheritance I set aside for my grandchildren? He paused, looking at everyone at the table. I had planned to split it evenly. 3 ways. But now, seeing how you've treated 2 of your children like they don't exist while bending over backwards for Grace, I've decided that I need to rethink the division. Grace's eyes widened. What? Grandpa leaned forward, speaking slowly so everyone would hear. Grace will receive $30,000. The rest, $270,000, will be split between Kelsey and my grandson here. Grace shot up from her seat so fast the chair nearly fell over. That's not fair. You never told me you had that much set aside. I should get half. Grandpa didn't even blink. Why? What have you done to deserve it? Grace opened her mouth, but no words came out. Your brother worked his entire life for his future, and you were about to take it from him for another round of plastic surgery. You've had everything handed to you, and look where it got you. 2 failed marriages, no career, no skills. And you still expect the world to fix itself around you. She turned to my father in desperation. Dad, say something. My father looked like he had been punched in the gut. He turned to Grandpa, trying to salvage the situation. Dad, come on. You can't just cut her out like this. You're playing favorites. Grandma, who had been sitting quietly until now, finally spoke. We're not playing favorites. You did. We're just correcting your mistake. My mother looked like she wanted to cry, but my father was too stunned to respond. Grandpa stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. That's final. And just so we're clear, this money is now out of your hands. You don't get to touch a cent of it. If I find out you've pressured or manipulated either of them for it, you'll lose more than just the money. I had never seen my father look so helpless. Grace stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. My mother just sat there, shaking her head, like she couldn't believe what had just happened. I sat there, trying to process what had just happened. For years I had been invisible in my own family. For years I had been nothing more than an afterthought. But now I was the one who walked away with everything.